Hello, and welcome to season one of the Autonomous Health Podcast. We talk to scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs, VCs at the intersection of bringing machine learning and artificial intelligence to healthcare. I'm your host, Anmol Matan, computer scientist and entrepreneur in the digital health space. What can we learn about optimizing sleep from pilots and astronauts? In this episode, we talk about sleep sensing and countermeasures. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Cassie Hilditch, who is not only an incredible scientist, but also a dear friend. Cassie, hey, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Anmol. I know we've been talking about doing a podcast for a long time, so.
Yeah, for everybody listening on, Cassie and I took the Caltrain for many, many years, and we would often talk about all our scientific experiences and ideas. And we were like, this should be a podcast. And so really, Cassie, you get credit for shaping the vision behind making this real. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks for executing it.
So the goal for today, Cassie, was really learn more about you and then about science and sleep. And for everyone listening, Cassie is an expert not just in sleep, but on sleep for space and with astronauts and with pilots. And we're going to go deeper into what that means. And then also, how does that apply for what we're seeing in the consumer wellness world, with sleep as such an important signal, such an important source of what drives overall well-being for people, and something that we've spoken about extensively in chronic conditions, in mental health, both areas that I've been pretty involved with over the last decade and a half. So the goal is to really start with this understanding of this very extreme, acute sort of world of what sleep really is and means in these contexts, and then translate that for all of us as kind of people living our lives, and what lessons can maybe we draw from that science. But before we do that, Cassie, maybe just take a minute, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey and what brought you here as a person who's leading all of this research and doing all these interesting things.
Gosh, so I was born? No. Yeah, I'm from Adelaide, Australia originally, and have been working in the sort of sleep research world in one way or another for nearly 20 years. I sort of have worked in both a kind of consultant sort of perspective, where I work directly with industry, as well as sort of working on the academic side and doing, in-lab studies as well. So after a couple of postdocs on the East Coast of the US, I finally found my dream job over here in California. And so I'm now the senior research associate through San Jose State University.
So interesting journey, and obviously some incredible academic experiences. As we talk about sleep, and in particular sleep in these conditions, is it fair to say that you do a lot of research on sleep with astronauts? Is that the right categorization of, or how would you put your research area? How would you define yourself?
Yeah, so I would say predominantly my research is with pilots. I am sort of at least tangentially involved in research around astronauts, and I do a lot of reading in that area as well. So most of what I know is from reading other people's work in that area. But I have worked with sort of shift workers generally, whatever the industry. So a lot of extreme environments as well. So from sort of oil and gas exploration in Africa through to, space and all sorts of things.
Yeah. And so extreme environments and sleep, I mean, what is the most surprising thing about being in one of those environments, whether it's space, and obviously space has all sorts of flavors with, deep space missions and all those sorts of things that we can talk about, but also even being a pilot or working on an oil rig. Is it about how you manage, control, optimize sleep? Is that really what's surprising about it? What's hard about it? And why isn't just as simple and straightforward? I feel like all of us are born and we learn how to sleep when we're babies, well, most of us. And then how does that translate into, like, what's different about these extreme environments?
So there are a lot of questions that you just asked in one go. So I'll try to pass it out. Yes, we all sort of learn to sleep when we're little, and sleep is something that every living organism does in one way or another. And so it's something that's essential to living, to health. But the world that we currently live in, or the occupation that we might have, puts limits on our opportunities to sleep, both in the duration that we have sort of available for sleep, and then the timing of that availability as well. So think of shift workers. If you're working at night, it means you have to try to sleep during the day. And we are built to sleep at night and be awake during the day. We have, you might have heard of a body clock, otherwise known as circadian rhythms, which help align all of our physiological systems so that we're nice and awake during the day and have consolidated sleep at night. So when you have sort of, other things impinging on that, either, just physically meaning that you can't sleep because you're working, or your environment that you're sleeping in might not be conducive to sleep. So it might be noisy, really hot, something like that. And then there's sort of our psychological state too. So if we're really stressed or upset about something, it's going to be harder to sleep. So depending on what your daily life sort of brings to you in those kind of situations, that might be impacting your sleep as well. But I mean, you're talking about sort of what we can learn for everyday people based on sort of sleep and space, but we also think about it sort of the other way around, in that we're all human, so we all still have the same physiological systems and same need for sleep. And there's just a few more challenges in space to deal with than there is on Earth.
Yeah, and I think the interesting part, and I'll kind of tease out something you said there that I thought was really interesting and surprising, which is it's how do you maximize the benefits of sleep when you can't default to the body clock, circadian rhythm, and have these extenuating sort of circumstances where, I mean, if you're maybe a shift worker that has to work at night, that's one end of, the example. But also if you're a pilot and have to stay awake for 18 hours and then sleep for a brief amount of time. And so there's all these, it's almost like you've got to figure out how to hack and program many millions of years of evolutionary sort of sleep systems and go off and say, okay, we're actually going to optimize the heck out of it because this particular pilot or astronaut has to make it through the landing at this unfortunate time, which would totally mess up with their sleep schedule. So I think is that really what it comes down to, is how do you optimize sleep in those very extreme situations and then program your body and your brain to function there?
Yeah, so I think while I would use different terms in terms of hacking and optimizing, and I think that's
Yeah.
coming from different
Yeah.
backgrounds.
Yeah.
We talk about countermeasures and mitigation strategies and preparation strategies too. So,
Yeah.
but it's essentially the same thing in that we do research to find out what are the best schedules. We know that night shifts aren't going away, right? We're in this 24-hour society. We need our Amazon package the next day. Someone's going to drive it. But we can hack the system to minimize the impact of sort of doing night shift or stuff like that by designing the schedules themselves to minimize the amount of fatigue or sleepiness or sleep loss that's associated with them. But then we can also use things like light. Light is sort of talked about as the most powerful drug that we have when it comes to sleep, because it actually can be used to shift our sleep patterns, either sort of forward or backwards. So you go to bed sort of earlier or later. And it's not sort of a magic bullet where you can, suddenly, fly to France and immediately be on France time, but you can help you could potentially sort of prepare yourself to go there and then help sort of get over jet lag, for example, quicker than if you weren't using light strategically. So, yeah, the way that you schedule work, and then sort of exposure and avoidance of light, to sort of big things we can use to help minimize fatigue in those situations.
Yeah. And do you have an example of, and if you could just play out an example of, imagine, one of those situations where any of the professions you just described, oil rig workers or astronauts, what kind of sleep schedule or light manipulation could be used to help that professional achieve their goals? Do you have you can walk me through like what the interesting research or examples would be of that?
Yeah, so there have been studies looking at shifting sleep schedules of astronauts as they prepare for a launch, because that launch timing is based on a whole number of factors, weather and alignment and whatnot. And it's not sort of prioritizing where the astronauts' body clocks are at when they have to go through that process. So, but if there's a known launch time, they can work back a week or two and start shifting their body clock and their schedules to align with that new time. So if you wanted to delay your sleep, so go to bed later, wake up later, then you would seek bright light in those late evening hours and avoid light in the morning when you would normally wake up. And then the opposite is true if you wanted to shift the other way. You want bright light in the morning and avoiding bright light in the evening. So it sounds very simple, but at the same time, that timing is also very dependent on each individual's body clock. And that's not always in alignment with our world clock. So in timing that light, you have to be really careful that you don't accidentally send them the wrong way.
Yeah, so it's almost like a personalized sleep schedule lighting system. And then there's a number of tools and products on the market, obviously, that help with at least the lighting part of it and the sleep schedule part of it. But really, those become are those the sort of principal levers to pull when it comes to maximizing or optimizing how one operates in these environments with sleep being a constraint?
Yeah, I think certainly the most research has gone into light because it appears to be the most promising intervention in terms of being able to implement it in the field as well. It's not just sort of a lab-based thing. So the sort of intensity of the light, the irradiance of the light, and the spectrum as well. So shorter wavelength lights, more of that blue end of the spectrum, our bodies are particularly sensitive to that light for that phase shift in sleep. We have special cells in our eyes that aren't used for vision. They're sort of a non-visual component, but they receive that blue light, and that tells the little cluster of cells in our brain that is our pacemaker, who's conducting all the other systems in the body to fall in line with that pattern. So that bright blue light is kind of the key that we're using at the moment.
Very cool. Very interesting. So we started to talk about obviously these extreme situations, and all of us have long haul flights and time zone things, and maybe once in a while, once a few times a year, we have to go through these situations if we're not in one of those professions that you just described. But I think there's been obviously a massive consumer movement around measuring sleep. And in mental health, for example, managing stress, anxiety, depression, in a number of chronic conditions, sleep and lifestyle change are very essential to delivering the clinical outcomes and getting people to live healthier lives and drive better outcomes over time. Whether it's managing their stress levels, or in many cases that translates into managing their diabetes or hypertension or even more serious conditions. And so you've seen this sort of trend where we have a few trends in parallel, right? So we have the trend where like things that disrupt and mess up our sleep have probably exploded in the last 50 or 100 years, and most of those are technology driven. And I'd say particularly in the last kind of couple of decades with like smartphones and all these other variables that we didn't have to probably design our biology didn't have to design for over millions of years. You've got the other trend, which is the ability to measure and understand and then say here's a way that, to your point, the right steps and right classes of interventions to direct sleep in the consumer world has really exploded in the last few years, in particular I'd say the last decade. And there's numerous devices, the Oura Ring and so many other devices, the Fitbits, that are trying to measure this using often accelerometers or other sensors that are hopefully, and we can talk about whether they are or not, but hopefully correlated with the quality of sensing one would expect in a real sleep lab. So talk to me about those trends and what does that mean for sleep research overall, and I mean, there's a measurement aspect which maybe is more feasible today, and I have some views on that too, and we can kind of go back and forth on those. But then there's the other part, which is how do you act on that information, and what are the right interventions or actions to, I mean, if you think of a closed loop system that is optimizing unknown sleep or Cassie sleep, how would we design, or what would such a closed loop system look like? So maybe a two-part question on that one.
I think it's generous
And,
to say
and
that's
by the
a
way, as you can see, the
two-part.
trend here is these are multi-part questions that I just like throw at you, and part of the job is to break them into bite-sized pieces.
I think there's at least 10 questions in there, but let me try to hit most of them. So, yes,
This is season
Yeah.
one, so we're still learning.
So definitely this, boom in technology of what, we call wearables. So your Fitbits, your Oura Rings, whatnot. Starting off with the positives, obviously, they the potential to collect data from huge sample sizes. Again, sort of from a researcher's perspective, the cost of them is pretty low compared to the sort of research grade actographs that we've used in the past.
And sorry, when you say low, are we talking orders of magnitude low?
Uh, yes. Yeah, I mean, give it depending on what it is that you're using, it's definitely easier to sort of scale up using, or your participants might already have that device and they've bought it themselves. So there's the potential to get sort of this huge amounts of data, and the sort of scientific research community or sleep community, it moves pretty slowly. But the academic science stuff moves pretty slowly, and then the technology side moves really
Yeah.
quickly. So to give an example, in 2016, there was an editorial written about this boom in technology of sleep wearables, and how would we as a sleep community benefit from it, and what are the sort of challenges from it. And then that sparked a meeting in 2018 of people sort of talking about it. And then from that meeting, there was a publication in 2020 saying like, oh, this is our review of wearables. But meanwhile, in that time, we're now 2023. In that time,
Yeah.
there's been probably 10 different Fitbits that have come out on the market. And so it's really difficult with the different pacing of timelines for the research community to keep up with the tech community. And so that introduces a couple of challenges and limitations for the use of those products, because while it's exciting that they could be used you know in research and diagnostics in personal health, in order to use them in that way and not just something that's a little bit of fun and a bit educational about my sleep as an individual, but not making any major decisions based on that information, we really need to be able to set guidelines and standards for how to interpret that data. And that takes rigorous scientific performance evaluation studies, comparing them to gold
Right.
standard measures, and a number of papers have come out doing that. But again, by the time they're published, on the Fitbit 1, there's a Fitbit 10. And because it's all proprietary algorithms, we don't know what's changed in the hardware and the software and the algorithms. So we don't know whether the performance evaluation from one version would hold to the next one.
Yeah, and I think, and by the way, before you answered, part 17 of that 30-part question, actually, I think there's a precedent for this, and this is a common problem across a lot of healthcare, consumer healthcare pieces. And we can have this discussion of measuring heart rate, and there is the accuracy and fidelity, and does it match a validated clinical medical device. And I think that's an important discussion to have. And I wonder almost if we look for that sensor fidelity kind of accuracy problem, we look for examples outside of healthcare. And so I think of, there's tools like ML is an example. ML Commons. There's these tools, the industry standard bodies, often they're nonprofit, where you can create new kinds of sensors, or you can create new kinds of models or new kinds of GPUs and so on, and they'll run a standard industry benchmark, and everybody's kind of shaking their hand and said this is the industry benchmark for how we measure GPU performance, for example, for machine learning models. And so there are these sort of almost industry-wide bodies, but people have to the different players have to sign up and be part of it. And the reason they want to be part of it is because they want to be seen as the accurate sort of validated measure, or part of it. So I think it's different levels of how you solve this consumer. There's sort of hey, what should be a medical device and regulated by the FDA because it's driving clinical decisions and so on. But then there's the sort of fitness, wellness, I'm just curious about my lifestyle, quantified self view. And even in the quantified self view, it sounds like you're saying there's room for standardization, measurement. And it's almost like when you ship a device, you ship, Fitbit 15, it runs through the standard tests that other sleep devices have gone through for a scientist or even a consumer to know that this is how much accuracy I can expect. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would make sense to have a a body, an institution that validates. Well, I'm trying to stay away from the term validation because it's a performance evaluation, which if it shows that it's um, a valid measure, then it's a validation. But otherwise, it can.
And I do think, by the way, in the consumer world, if it's a consumer sort of self quantified self kind of device, it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate, right? As long as there's an awareness of the level of accuracy, and you're trading off accuracy for convenience, cost, ease of usability. I mean, you could have $5 sensors that you just throw in a bag and forget in an airport. They measure sleep or they measure other parameters, as long as we're not using those in a clinical application like diagnosing sleep apnea that requires a much higher level of sensor fidelity and a real sleep lab to do it. So I think as long as that boundary is clear, you can do a lot of stuff, I think, in the consumer wellness space, is my thesis.
Yeah, I partially agree with that because I mean, if I think about the step counter in my phone, I use it to sort of, set goals for myself. It doesn't matter whether it's accurate at counting how many steps I have, and I'm not basing any sort of major decisions on it. I just use it as a goal to try to, get as minimum steps per day or whatever. And so for the sleep apps, same deal. It's a great way for people to become interested in their sleep, to be able to sort of again set a goal to try to get more sleep every night. I think though there are potentially positive behavioral changes because of the apps. We have to acknowledge that there's potentially negative behavioral changes or impacts as well. So there's this amazing study that showed that if you tell people that they didn't get very good sleep, then not only do they feel more tired the next day, they even perform worse and their brain activity changes.
Oh,
So just that sort of placebo effect or nocebo effect, if you say someone you slept really well, it can actually improve their performance. So if your sleep app isn't accurate and it's giving you information that sort of you then kind of feel differently about, then that's potentially a problem. I mean, I'm not saying it's a huge problem or anything like that, but it's just some things to think about. And, there's still people that maybe someone thinks that their sleep's really bad, but then their app tells them, oh, you got 8 hours of sleep. Your sleep score is 99%. And they're like, oh, I don't need to go to the doctor about this because
yeah.
my sleep tracker says that it's fine. So,
Yeah, there's a noisy signal here, and if
yeah,
you assume that it's sort of loosely correlated with the ground truth and it isn't a perfect signal, then there's all sorts of interventions that start to break up because of that assumption. Yeah, so you're absolutely right.
I think the consumer just needs to be aware of the limitations of the device. And when you're selling it to millions of people, there's no way to control that, how people perceive it. And certainly, you know, people want to sell the devices, so they want to, tell you this is accurate. This can tell you if you're in light stage sleep, if you're in REM sleep, they can't tell you which sleep stage they're in. It's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
50
It's not. It's like
is
we have
literally
an estimated probability. Yeah,
yeah.
no, for sure. And I mean, look, unless you're really using obviously ways to measure that from brain activity. I think, to my knowledge, it's actually really hard to do with any sort of external sensor,
Yeah, and
just to identify sleep states.
it's a shame that a lot of the devices are pushing this sleep stages information because the accuracy of the total sleep time is actually pretty good.
Right.
They're very good at detecting sleep, so they have a high sensitivity to detect sleep, but they are less good at detecting wake. So they sort of have a low specificity for sleep. And so that's why they tend to, on average, overestimate the amount of sleep you got. But that bias is pretty consistent. Whereas the sleep staging it's just not there yet. But I think it by the companies claiming that that is something that they can offer, it kind of undermines what they can offer because now I'm sort of like, well, what can I trust about what you're selling me?
Yeah, but I would also argue that your expertise is significantly greater than the average consumer who's sort of not making that judgment call, right? As a scientist, you're obviously an expert in the field, and you're saying there's all sorts of things you're presenting here that may not be measurable using the fact that you're simply using an accelerometer or on phone sensors. I want to go back to the way we think of that. I mean, noisy consumer data, by the way, is not my view on this is I don't think that's necessarily useless. I think there's a way to interpret, use, and find value, and the benefit is you have scale. And I think what I've seen in other problems, and not sleep specifically, but certainly in other sensor data, like including activity, is you almost want a pre-processing layer that's going through and saying, given this noisy input, I'm going to create an estimate of how good Anmol's sleep is. And based on that, there are probably a set of default interventions, actions, recommendations that can allow him to be as, perform at the level of an elite athlete or an astronaut or a pilot, which I'm very far away from that level of performance, just to be clear, but like would get the person there. And then there are going to be some of those that, and the phrase that we often use in some of the teams that I've run is failing gracefully, where you do want to do the personalized insights or advice, but you want to do them in a way that they're not harmful if you're wrong because you're working with noisy, incomplete data. And so it's sort of like you want to pick the recommendations where you're not sending an ambulance to a person's door, but you're sort of maybe giving them advice. And the worst case, the advice is like less relevant than it would have been. But to me, that's an example of then taking these noisy signals and creating a system or loop of interventions where you're sort of managing the risk and failing in a very safe, clean, harmless, possibly slightly less engaging, but otherwise harmless way. Does that resonate, or do you think do you sort of
Yeah,
buy that idea?
if you're just giving recommendations that are true no matter what your sleep is, almost, that like just tips to get a better sleep, like even if you get a good score, you're like, that's great, keep up on these things or something like that. Yeah, I think that would be the sort of safest approach, as you said, sort of do no harm, which is an ethical principle. So, yeah, I mean, I think, again, at that sort of consumer level, for me, it's sort of the not over promising or over claiming what it can provide. And so, but you've still got to sell it and make it exciting. So it's sort of finding a line there.
Yeah. So I think the base level feedback, I totally agree. I think the question is, can you do personalized feedback? Where the advice in the app is start adjusting your lighting in your room by X minutes if you're 2 weeks away from taking a flight to Europe. Right. And then the question is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't actually have the opposite effect, to your point earlier, where you're not pushing a person away from the ideal sleep schedule and situation, but you're actually getting them, like ideally when you buy your airline ticket, it comes with like the sleep coaching component that says, well, you're going to be flying for 17 hours. So here's when you should start adjusting your sleep schedule. And by the way, here's what you can do and, program your Hue lights at home with this little light snippet or script, and that'll take care of it for you. So I think, again, I'm sort of imagining a future that is very different from the one we live in today. But the
Yeah.
idea being taking those interventions that today maybe are used to train astronauts or fighter pilots and then bringing them down for the average person who's probably going through similar circumstances.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there are a couple of apps that try to estimate sort of where your body clock's at in order to provide sort of, yeah, recommendations on when to seek light and avoid light for international travel, and when to use caffeine and how to use it strategically. So there's a couple of things there. But I think the key piece missing in order to make this a personalized and therefore sort of minimize the potential to shift them the wrong way is being able to estimate someone's circadian rhythm, the phase of it, without having to lie in a bed in the dark for 24 hours in a sleep lab, because that's kind of the gold standard at the moment, which isn't scalable by any extent.
Are there clusters that people fall into? We see this a lot with other human behavior data. So whether it's your activity patterns or your communication with others, or even things like blood glucose, And CGMs, for example, continuous glucose monitors, offer the ability to measure blood glucose at a very high frequency that was sort of almost impossible previously, every 5 minutes, every few minutes. And so what that sort of starts to show is that people start to fall in clusters. And all you need to do then is actually give people a device or CGM or some of those in many cases for a brief amount of time so you can identify what clusters they're part of, and you can do interesting things with that sort of data. Is there a parallel for that with sleep measurement where it's not about the perfect sleep lab experiment, but just saying, hey, there's 4 or 5 phenotypes or clusters and this person belongs to the third one?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, you could cluster by, tertiles in the
Yeah.
the range that you have. So, for example, in a study looking at pilots, they were all on the same schedule. So they were all sort of having to wake up at the same time and perform the same and go and had the same sort of sleep opportunities within those, and it wasn't that many individuals. I think there was a range of about 5 hours as to where the low in their body clock was, and that's a huge range,
Right.
right? For
Right.
people all living in the same time zone, doing the same thing. So you could probably identify people who are later, earlier, and somewhere in the middle from that, and then tailor things to those groups. And what we're seeing in the research now is sort of whether we can monitor someone's sleep and wake for a week or two using some sort of wearable, and from that information determine where their body clock would be to be able to then deliver interventions in a timely fashion. And a key part of that, I believe, would be also measuring light. So in our research grade actigraphs, it has a light sensor as well. So we can use that information. And as we've been talking about, the light exposure can, directly affect this. So, but I don't think I've seen a light sensor on consumer wearables because it's not intuitively important for companies just measuring sleep and heart rate and whatnot.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think a lot of them are going to be listening to this podcast and taking notes as you say that. So this has been great, Cassie, and we can talk for hours. Are there things about sleep that you want to reinforce or share before we pause today? Are there topics or aspects you think like we haven't covered?
So I think you framed it nicely at the start about how important sleep is. I think of it as the third pillar of health. You hear a lot about diet and exercise, but without sleep, doesn't matter how much you exercise or what you eat, you're not going to maximize the health benefits unless you have enough sleep. And I'd say that as a research community, we've focused on the amount of sleep that you get. So sleep duration, total sleep time. But where a lot of the research is shifting is towards the regularity of your sleep pattern. So how much does it vary day to day? And we're finding in these early studies that not just how much you sleep, but the timing of your sleep is actually associated with a lot of the same sort of both physical and mental health outcomes. So I don't know whether, in terms of personalizing the sleep apps, whether there's AI that looks at how a person has been sleeping and then adjusts the algorithms to predict when they would sleep next. Because I see a potential problem in that if it basically artificially sort of caps that variation because it's expecting to see sleep at a certain time. So just something to think about, that, that variability in the timing of sleep, I don't think that's factored into any of the like sleep scores and that kind of thing in the feedback. So that could be the next thing
Yeah.
to incorporate.
Yeah. So I think some really exciting things happening in the field, and lots of opportunities for these sensors as well as the algorithms that all of us is using as consumers to become sharper and smarter and more relevant. And it's almost, I would even go as far as saying, Cassie, I think we've seen the first generation of these devices, and there's probably a second and third generation that can truly achieve the vision of how you've been describing it and what one might expect in a true sleep lab environment. But certainly a very exciting opportunity for the next decade or so. With that, I did want to thank Dr. Cassie Hilditch for taking out the time to talk to us about sleep, not just sleep for extreme situations such as pilots and astronauts and people working on oil rigs, but also how we learn those lessons and translate those for in our lives every day. And what does that mean for sensors and interventions that we are using as consumers? So thank you again, Cassie. This has been wonderful. And thanks for coming on as a guest.
Great. Thanks for having me. It was fun to chat.
For everybody listening, once again, thanks again for listening. This is the Autonomous Health Podcast. We will try to release our episodes on a regular cadence, and you should be able to find them online as well as in your favorite podcast app. So once again, thanks again. This is Anmol, and have a good rest of your day.